I'm Morris Berger. I'm joining you from Melbourne, Naarm in Australia. I know we have people tuning in from across the country and around the world. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're joined by someone who's been driving this change for decades, Sara Stace, to explore what's possible when we rethink safety and connection and community altogether. So, Sara, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Morris, and thank you everyone for joining, taking time out of your afternoon and your busy schedules to listen in. I will start sharing my screen, and I'm going to basically present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll turn over to you guys for questions. So as we're going, please feel free to pop your questions into the question or Q&A chat area, but I can't see those, and I don't think I can see people put their hands up. So just be aware, I can't see everyone very well, but I will jump into my slide. So today I'm going to be talking about the topic of slower streets and stronger neighbourhoods. And we're going to cover a lot of topics in this, and then sort of end with a bit of, I guess, some tools for action, which you'll see in a moment. But first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the land of the Gadigal people, who are the Whale people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present. I'm really lucky in Sydney that I can go for about a 15-minute walk and I can get down to the ocean and see the whales going past. And at the moment, you can see all the mums and calves going past. It's just so joyous, and I can completely see why the whales form such an important part of the Dreamtime stories. So beforehand, I think everyone, when you registered, you got the chance to ask some questions, and Morris sent some of them through. So I'm going to try and answer these questions, some of these as I go, and hopefully, but also if you've got more, just pop them into the chat. But essentially, I'm going to go through a bit of an introduction. I'll look at what some of the key challenges and what I like to call the root causes behind why we have these challenges. And I'll look particularly at some of the assumptions in business as usual and introduce the concept of the Overton window, if you haven't heard of that before. Then we're going to look at how do we address some of these, and what are some of the things I found in literature, in reading about systems change and so on, that can help provide those building blocks for change, and then go through some of those tools for change. So I'll talk about storytelling and connecting with what people value. And then we'll end with what you can do from here. So some very, very practical tips and tools for how you can take things forward. That hopefully I'll cover in about 20 minutes. And then we'll go to a full Q&A. So this is my day job. I work for Vivendi Cities as the Director of Cities, and we work on a whole lot of basically government-based documents. I've written a lot of guidelines around really the central theme of creating great places for people. This is my absolute passion. This is what I get out of bed every day. I just really love the idea of how we create these better places. And I'm very lucky to be in a situation where I get paid to do that on a whole lot of different projects for different government agencies. However, one of the things I've learned over all of this time, and having worked for 15 years in all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, is that data and evidence is not actually the best way to convince politicians. And I often wheel out this diagram. This actually came originally from the Dutch Cycling Embassy by Lucas Harms et al. And it talks about hardware, as you can see. This is about Fiona Campbell on her bike on a rainbow pathway in Sydney. That's the hardware, that's the infrastructure. The software are the things I just showed you, the guidelines and strategies, and also the funding. But what we also need is the third element of orgware, the political support, the community support and advocacy. And we need that as a loud, positive, clear message for change, because that's what the politicians need to hear, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And what I found when I was working as a bureaucrat is that I can create the software and I can help get the funding for the construction of the hardware. But what a bureaucrat generally can't do is the orgware side. And that's where all of you on this recall, you can do this type of work. And it's one of the reasons why we created Better Streets. So in my not day job, in my completely volunteer pro bono day, I have been a co-founder of Better Streets, and we have 5 key recommendations. So one of those is to get kids active, to set those sort of lifelong healthy habits for kids, to get them to be able to walk, cycle, scoot, and take public transport. We also want to make it easy and convenient to walk by adding new and improved crossings across councils all the time. So continuing to add more and more in. Slow vehicles down to make local streets and shopping streets quieter and safer, particularly our pushes for 30 kilometres an hour. And I'll come into that later. To boost local business by creating these shopping streets that are welcoming and fun for people to enjoy and spend time in. And then, of course, to make it easy to ride a bike with connected and direct infrastructure that's suitable for people of all ages and abilities. And these are some of our partners. We have over 100 organisations that have signed up to that. If your organisation is not represented with its logo here, it's free to join up and become a partner member, as long as you agree to those 5 recommendations that I mentioned just. So what are some of the key challenges and root causes behind what causes these challenges? I'm going to start with the mysterious case of motor normativity. This is an assumption that we tend to have. If you haven't come across the term before, it basically means car brain. And I'm going to give you an example. So let's compare sharks with cars. And if you could just, because I can't really see the responses, but if you can enter into the chat 2 figures. I want you to put one figure is how many people in Australia you think have been killed by sharks since 1791. And the second figure, I want you to put how many people you think have been killed by cars since 1925. So in the last 100 years. So put 2 figures into the chat. There have been 260 shark fatalities, people killed by sharks in the last 234 years, and 779 seriously injured. And over the last 100 years, there's been nearly 200,000 people killed by motor vehicles and nearly 1.5 million seriously injured just in the last 44 years. I didn't have data going back earlier than 1981. It's pretty shocking. But I guess we tend to have, again, you could maybe put your hand up. Put up your hand if you're perhaps a little bit scared of going in the water because you're worried about. A lot of people don't like doing deep ocean swimming because they're terrified of sharks. And I know that in Sydney, there's been a fatality recently. And so people are saying, I don't really want to go in the water right now. So referring to that, on the left-hand side is a report that came out. I think this is from the ABC. This is when a person was unfortunately killed by a shark recently. And the report is on the left. I then thought, we don't get reports like this when it comes to cars. What I've done is I've flipped the word shark to ute, and I flipped the word surfer to walker and beach to street. And this is the fantasy headline that I'd like to see. Experienced walker and dad dies in ute crash. The street will stay shut for the next 48 to 72 hours, whilst other neighbouring streets will stay closed for 24 hours. We'll continue to assist council and authorities to protect the public in any way we can. Drones are scanning the streets for danger. Now, I love this quote because I haven't even changed any of the wording here, except the word streets and beach. At some point, we're going to walk back out on the streets. I know people who don't walk would look at us and say, that's absolutely crazy, but that's the risk that we accept. I think for me, this is such a great example of motor normativity, where we're so we've been so exposed to vehicle fatalities that we don't blink an eye just because, like, I know that on our street, we had someone killed a couple of years ago, and no one changed their behaviour as a result of that person being killed on our very normal local street. We just accept that. And yet a couple of weeks before that, somebody was killed off a beach near our place, and they did exactly the same. There were drones and so on. So I think that motor normativity is a massive problem for us because we accept fatalities and serious injuries. These sorts of numbers are just business as usual and something that we completely accept in Australia and globally. The second assumption that I wanted to challenge is that Australia needs more roads and we definitely need more suburbs. So as transport planners, urbanists, land use planners, whatever your role is, if it's involved in this kind of built environment space, you're probably involved in the industry that is, its foundation is based on building more roads and building more suburbs. And so I'll explain why this is problematic. This slide might take a little while for me to explain. So we've got here Alicia. So she was born in 1990, so she's now 35 years old. And for the first few years of her life, so she lives in the outer suburbs of one of our major cities and has always relied on a car. So as a child, she obviously had to be driven around. Obviously, you do need to drive kids around. And then she got to earn her license. And so she's been driving since then. Now she's 35, so she's just had a baby and she's going to be driving that child around until that child can then be able to drive. And then when she gets older, she'll have to give up her driver's license. Perhaps she's developed glaucoma or something like that. And she now has to depend on others to get around. Now, compare that to Zara, who lives in a townhouse and lives close to public transport. And for her entire lifetime, she has a range of transport options. And so that means she's not dependent on a car. She could, in theory, live her whole life without needing a car. Now, if we just add to that another little section here that I just put in, which is that Australia has a target to reach a 65 to 70% reduction in our emissions by 2035 and net zero by 2050. And look where that appears in Alicia and Zara's lives. How can we get to net zero if we keep doing that sort of very car dependent type development? So land use, and notice on here, I talked about both the location and the transport because land use and transport are intrinsically intertwined. So if we follow this logic path, from number one, there's a demand for more housing. Obviously, population growth requires us to build more housing, and we all know that we're under a massive crisis for housing at the moment. The solution, if we build in these outer metro areas that are dependent on cars, there are some outer metro areas that have good public transport, but mostly not. And that is enabled by car travel and more road building. Number three means we need more roads to access that expansion. Number four means we need to also expand existing roads. And that leaves absolutely no money for public and active transport, or very little. And we're not going to get to net zero. And more driving means more fatalities. If we flip that and looked at that demand for more housing still exists, but we do that through building in well-serviced locations with infill and transit-oriented development, which I also like to call pedestrian-oriented development. And we're building in areas that have quality public transport with medium to high density. And we then invest in public and active transport. There's less demand for roads, so there's less road building. And there's more money that's left for other priorities, which can include housing, education, public transport and so on. So we're avoiding the need to travel, we're avoiding the need for more roads, we've got avoiding the need of the increase in road fatalities, and we achieve more livable cities. So I think it's really important for us to talk to those two hand in hand. The other myth I want to talk about is the myth of traffic growth. So when you look at most transport traffic modelling, there's an assumption, and I'm very happy to be challenged. I'm sure there'll be people on this call who want to challenge me. Please do in the chat. But most business cases do assume that there will be growth in traffic, whether it's 2% or 2.5%. And in fact, BITRE, the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics, that's the Australian federal agency, has written numerous reports about how often they have gotten this wrong over the last several decades. They always assume growth is going to go up, and they're always wrong. So I looked at the data across hundreds of traffic count stations throughout New South Wales, and there is an anomaly in 2016 where it suddenly plummeted. Clearly, there was a bit of an error in the data there, so I've taken that out. But you can see over the last decade, there has been zero growth in traffic. This is the number of average daily traffic per count station. So the idea that traffic grows is not supported by data. And in fact, Australia reached peak car in the year 2004, that's 21 years ago, that is when we had the most highest vehicle kilometres travelled per person, and that has been dropping year on year since then. Now, we've had population growth since then, so that's kept us overall zero growth in traffic, but nonetheless, it is not a problem that we need to actually deal with. So I'm going to introduce this idea now of the Overton window. And if you haven't heard of it, essentially, usually it's applied to politics, but essentially it says you've got policy and things that are slightly within that still are things that are highly popular. Then when you start to get moves further and further away from the Overton window, you get things that are sensible, to acceptable, to radical, to unthinkable. But I thought I'll apply that to the idea of urban streets. It used to be that 60 kilometres an hour was the default urban speed limit in Australia. And I think in the late 90s, we introduced 50 kilometres an hour, and each state took slightly different times to bring that in. But essentially, that is now central policy, and that the Overton window shifted from 60 to 50. However, if you talk about 40 kilometres an hour, there are some areas of Australia where it's like, yeah, I think that's probably sensible to even accept, to acceptable. But to talk about 30 is pretty radical, perhaps even completely unthinkable. And the same, we've got movement in place sits in kind of very central policy nowadays. But and street festivals with kind of temporary use is acceptable. But closing streets entirely to traffic so that you can have safe streets outside schools is pretty unthinkable in most locations. And then you could apply that to parking and all sorts of different urban ideas that we often want to talk about within this type of group. So I think it can be a really useful way to think about our framing. And so if I go back to that original thing where I talked about the hardware, software, and orgware, I realised over time that sits within the Overton window. And what I'm talking about here is trying to shift that Overton window, particularly when you're trying to introduce things like 30 kilometres an hour or reallocating street space away from cars. Because we're stuck in this motor normativity, we need to shift that Overton window, and that is really hard. So how do we address some of these? Are there tools available for do these things? And the answer very happily is yes, we do have some ways to do it. So I'm going to take you through some that I've found useful. One is from a book by Greg Settle on cascades, how to create a movement that drives transformational change. And there's a free workbook and things like that, but I've tried to distill it down to a couple of slides. He talks about there being, you need to have, for these building blocks of change, three things. You need to have a clear vision of what fundamental change looks like, so very clearly articulate what success looks like. You need to appeal to the majority of people and create a broad spectrum of allies who relate to others, and I'll come to what I mean by that in a moment. And then the third one is to create these pillars of support through institutions with government, academia, industry, community organisations, and so on. So I'll give you an example. So if we come to this, where I talked earlier about better streets, and we've set a very clear vision of what success looks like. So for example, we've said $30 per person invested annually through 50-50 federal and state into active transport would completely transform the funding environment and get better outcomes for people across Australia to achieve these things. We think you could get back to 75% of children walking, cycling, catching public transport, because that's what it was 50 years ago. We think you need 20 crossings per council, setting a default 30-kilometre-hour speed limit, putting in outdoor dining, for example, outside cafes and restaurants, and say 100 kilometres per year of building cycling infrastructure per state. So these things are very clear articulation of what success looks like, and that's fundamental when you're looking at change. Appealing to the majority. So I've created a diagram based on the way it's described in the book. This diagram doesn't appear in the book, but I've created this. So I would say that majority of people on this call, I'm going to make a guess, we probably sit in the passionate advocates side of this bell curve. So we're the early adopters, but it's really important if we want to bridge that chasm, get into the tipping point, we need to reach and appeal to the people who are slightly interested, and even more important, to the neutral and oblivious people who really to them, urbanism and livable cities, it's never really perhaps occurred to them to worry or think about it, and perhaps they shouldn't have to. But that, what I'll call a higher threshold person, needs to feel attracted to the cause and to hear it from multiple trusted sources. Now, the reason why that matters is because, as I've put in that sort of bright green text there, politicians don't want to hear, they're not convinced by people like me, they're not convinced by the passionate advocates, they are convinced by someone who looks like they represent the ordinary person or the majority of the electorate, because it gives them a sense that actually this is a popular idea and the majority of people would support it, and the haters is a very small proportion of the population. Usually they only hear from the haters. And so it's really important for us when we're creating a movement to change that Overton window, to reach through those thresholds of resistance. And then the third building block that I mentioned was creating these coalitions that are united around a vision. So again, as I talked about with Better Streets, we try and reach out to people who are concerned about climate, people who are concerned about their children, so parents groups, the Transport Professionals Association, Committee for Sydney and so on, representing walking, cycling, place, all sorts of different interests, because again, we don't want to come across as a bunch of, I guess, minority people. This is how you get more of that perception that we're represented by a large group of people. And one of the other things is to try and find the unlikely allies who it's like, really? So the Automobile Association of Australia would actually support 30 kilometres an hour in, particular locations. Well, wow, I wouldn't have expected that. So that's kind of one of the ways that you can help build those pillars for change. Ruth Bader Ginsburg might be known to some people, but I love this quote from her. She said, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." And so that brings me to the third component that I was going to talk about, which is these tools for change. And in that, so I talked about the fact that in my day job, I'd work on evidence. And when I worked as a public servant, I was always there doing evidence. But it's also important to have that compelling story from the community, because when you combine the evidence and story, that's where you get the persuasion happening. So the facts inform people, but you need those human stories to persuade. And when you combine those two is when you get those shifted mindsets. And I'm going to give an example of Grace. So I've put here that Grace changed the Commissioner's mind. When Lucy Turnbull was the head of the Greater Cities Commission for Sydney, I was talking to her about some work that I was doing for government on cycling, and I could see she was interested, but her eyes were sort of glazing over slightly. I hope Lucy doesn't mind my saying this, but she looked a little like, yeah, okay. And then I brought this photo up, and this is Grace. She lives in Bondi Junction. She's living with a disability, so you can see on the bottom there, she's got her handicapped sign. She really struggles to walk, so she can't walk to the bus stop, because if you see her, although she can walk and she uses an assistant, like a walker, it's really, really, really slow. So she can't walk easily to the bus stop. It's pretty unaffordable to catch taxis everywhere. So she has this electric tricycle and she zips around the Bondi Junction area. She goes to church. She's out seeing people in cafes. She does all her shopping. This is her lifeline. And when I explained Grace's story to Lucy, suddenly she just had this light bulb moment and went, "Oh, so this is who you're creating all this cycling infrastructure for?" And I was like, yes, we're creating it for people like Grace. So that's an example of using that compelling story can be much more convincing. So the last sort of, I guess, reference I'll make is around Catherine Hayhoe. Again, a really great book. She's written Saving Us, a client scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world, but she has some very practical actions that you can use. And I've, again, tried to distill these down. She says, we don't have to convince people to care about something that they don't. We need to show them how the things they already care about are affected. And then she goes on to say, everyone has values, even if they're not the same as yours. If you think they don't care, it's because they haven't connected the dots. And when they do, they'll see for themselves that it's entirely consistent with who they are. And so what she's saying is that it's not everyone has their Wi-Fi them, the what's in it for me antenna out. And so when you're presenting things to them, it's really important to use that. So for example, you need to connect with what people value and not what you care about as much as what you think the audience, the person you're talking to, is going to care about, what's going to resonate with them. So I've got some examples here to finish off with. And that is, for example, if you've got a local councillor, they might be concerned about being re-elected and their local reputation. So being able to say, as we demonstrated before, this change is popular with families and businesses in your ward, in your council. A parent with the young kids might be worried about safety, time, and stress. And so saying, look, if it's easier and safer for your child to walk to school in their friends' houses, and it also means you don't have to drive them as often, which means freedom for you as a parent. And so you can see that you can unravel some of these things by presenting the same overall outcome. You're just presenting in a way that appeals to that person's Wi-Fi, the what's in it for me. And that's really important. And Catherine Hayhoe goes into this in a lot of detail for that. So I was going to end, before we move to the chat, on some actions that you can take away from this, hopefully. And you don't have to do all of them. You might just pick one. And they are obviously join more events with the Liveable Cities Collective, like you have today. Thank you. You could join Better Streets, where on LinkedIn we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to for free. We also have a Slack channel if you want to get more involved and chit-chatting with others. We've got different topics and different chapters for states all around Australia. You can join as a member and you can also volunteer. So they're kind of different tiers of getting involved. You could learn the craft of storytelling, and Laura Aston has just said that she's going to do a storytelling workshops coming up. You could share your passion with people outside your comfort zone. So what I mean is you could practice some of these things, and as you're doing that, get more and more experience with trying to resonate with other people's values. And the fifth one is to join your own professional association or professional organisation to their policy and advocacy groups and see if you can get involved in some of that change of the Overton window. So that's all from me there. Was there anyone who I guess disagreed with those three assumptions I made? So I made one assumption about I talked about our assumption of motor normativity. I talked about a second assumption around this need for more roads and more suburbs. And what was my third assumption was that there's traffic growth, the myth of traffic growth. So I'd be keen to hear from someone who disagreed with one of those three things that I put up. Vehicles driven per capita has dropped in Perth and WA. Every single state, every capital city, every territory has been dropping since 2004 on a per capita basis. Yeah. So to answer your question about best practice model for safer streets, I think anywhere, in my view, anywhere that's been able to bring in slower, calmer streets, that kind of 30 kilometres an hour. I mean, we know there are cities like Oslo and Helsinki that have recently reached 0 fatalities in those cities. Again, they're doing that through really slowing down and calming traffic, getting rid of on traffic. So, and then again, you know, I just mentioned Japan, pretty much all the streets, the local sort of smaller streets on there are all very, very slow streets.